This isn't just something that happens somewhere, it's something that happens to people that you actually know.
Customers are driving a lot of change in this space because they want to see it, they want to shop and buy things from brands or products or services that have initiatives like this. So we're not just thinking about inclusion and, people fitting in, it's about actually people belonging and feeling like they belong.
Being open-minded and listening to employees so that you are ahead of the curve. Hello and welcome to our Business But Better podcast, brought to you by Irwin Mitchell. I'm Charlotte Rees-John, partner and head of our retail, leisure and hospitality sector at Irwin Mitchell, and I'll be your host today. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome and thanks for tuning in. This podcast brings you the stories and advice from industry experts to help you tackle the issues that matter to your organisation. The topic in this series is ESG, and today we'll be discussing a much talked about topic of ED&I, that's equality, diversity and inclusion. So to do so, I'm joined by two experts who will explain the real-world impact of getting ED&I right, the benefits it can have for your business, and the pitfalls of not prioritising it. So firstly, I'd like to welcome my colleague, William Noel-Flint, welcome, who is our Diversity and Inclusion Manager at Irwin Mitchell. And I'm also delighted to welcome our guest, Ebony Quow, Lead People Partner at JD Sports. Ebony has worn many hats as a salesperson, fitness instructor, rugby player, and currently is a member of the Diversity in Retail's Advisory Board as a graduate of their Ethnic Future Leaders programme. ED&I has over recent years become a board-level conversation. People are becoming increasingly aware of social injustices and are looking to their favourite brands to use their platforms for change. So, Ebony, if it's okay, I'm going to tap into your experience first. And can you tell our listeners a little bit about your involvement with ED&I to date, why you've chosen to become a leading voice on this topic, both obviously at JD Sports, but also with diversity in retail?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that has always been deeply important to me, but probably more so from the start of my leadership journey. As a leader, certainly when I started out, not seeing, really any other people that looked like me. And it's always been important to me to stand as a role model, not only for my peers and all groups of people who really struggle to feel that they really truly belong in organisations. So my involvement might be just as a mentor, and really that's how it started, me mentoring other young people of colour starting off in their leadership careers, to helping formulate some of our employee resource groups, to just trying to bring stakeholders into conversations wherever I can in my roles, and being that person who's brave to start to bring those conversations to a wide range of stakeholders.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Is how we get involved. Often there's a personal element to being involved in ED&I, but being a mentor, being a role model for me is absolutely critical. So it's interesting to hear you say that. So in terms of the benefits that promoting ED&I can have within an organisation, what have you seen some of those benefits?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen lots around the data, haven't we? From ED&I strategies leading to productivity in teams, greater collaboration and greater profitability. But I think something to call out as a huge benefit is the ability to tap into lots and lots of talent, probably that's been untapped previously. That term of kind of the global majority is now out there, where organisations are starting to realise that to be competitive, huge benefit is to be able to tap into that talent. And if we think about, Gen Z in particular, they want to work for organisations that are equitable and have those equitable strategies. And I think I saw a stat the other day where I think by 2025, Gen Z is going to make up 25% of the workforce. So a huge benefit to organisations is them being able to tap into that talent of the future.
So obviously that's some of the benefits. Have you seen any where organisations have seen the pitfalls of not supporting ED&I, not supporting that inclusive culture?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly tough market out there at the moment. I think a huge pitfall is really where organisations aren't sort of honest and upfront about where they are in their journey, and perhaps maybe focusing too much on those quicker results, and not really focusing on that long-term measurable strategic type of strategies that do really lead to that change that we're talking about when we think about ED&I. I think that's a huge pitfall, to not really just own where you're at and then try and kind of use data, use your employee resource groups, and really start to build a strategic, measurable strategy.
Strategies. It's all very well saying have a strategy, but how do you go about doing that? How do you go? What is a good strategy? What does that look like?
I think Ebony's already touched on this so far, but I think the first thing you've got to do is have a good, robust set of data which you can work from to start with. You need to understand the baseline that you're working from, and then be able to set those measurable, realistic targets from that point. And I think a lot of that is about making sure that colleagues are coming on the journey with you. So you need to be authentic, you need to be transparent around what you're trying to do and where you're trying to get to as an organisation. And I think that will really help with the buy-in long term and make sure that people want to come on that journey with you. I think alongside that, you need to make sure that you're having an intersectional focus, that you recognise that people within the organisation, people outside the organisation that you're trying to work with on this, they all have multiple facets of their identity. People aren't just one characteristic or anything like that. So when you're looking at taking an approach, for example, with disability, you need to consider that people with disabilities might also be a certain gender, or they might be from a certain ethnic background as well, and that will all tie into how they experience the workplace and experience the wider world in general.
Have you got any examples of what that might look like in the workplace in terms of what can organisations do? What are some of the steps that they can take to achieve an inclusive workplace?
I think you need to engage your key stakeholders. Ebony's already talked about ERGs, making sure that people with lived experience of different types of diversity and different types of perhaps discrimination or barriers that they've faced in the workplace, they have the opportunity to feed into the strategy and feed into the action plan that you're trying to achieve, to make sure that, there's the saying, nothing about us without us. Yeah. So making sure that we are being progressive in terms of making sure that those people have the opportunity to feed into what you're doing. And I think beyond there, you need to make sure that you've got senior leadership buy-in, whilst ultimately it's a great thing for ERGs to be involved in. ERG shouldn't be the ones leading a D&I strategy. That's got to come from a more senior level, and it's got to be cascaded down as well, to make sure that whether you're at the executive level at the top of an organisation, you're a colleague at entry level, or you're a middle manager, everybody understands their roles and are accountable to the strategy, and it needs to be embedded into everything that the organisation does.
Ebony, have you seen anywhere where that's been done well, or how that's done in practice?
I think where I've seen it done well, and Will's touched on this, is really that commitment from, right up from your PLC and exec boards, and then really being involved and championing it and committing to it, and that really being something that ties into not just the ED&I strategy but wider business values and the wider business strategy. That's where I've seen really meaningful change, and people sort of talking about it in the industry, and certainly talking about it as an attractor, and that's the huge thing to remember, is that it is something that people want now. They want to work for organisations where this is top of the list.
And I think the flip side of that, just to jump in there, is that whilst attraction is important, if your ED&I strategy and action within an organisation is inauthentic, then people will quickly see that. And whilst you might be attracting people and then them joining the organisation, there'll be a huge attrition gap at some point along the line if you're not matching that diverse ambition with the reality of an inclusive workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow on from that, I've saw some data recently around, I think it's about 80% of people of colour naturally tend to actually leave an organisation because they can't progress due to whatever barriers, culture in an organisation. So yeah, to mirror what Will said, it is kind of massive and can make a huge positive impact in your succession planning and having really great diverse talent right at the top.
And do you think storytelling is an important part of that? I've seen in terms of leaders or senior leaders within a business telling their own stories to try and demonstrate their engagement and their support for ED&I. Have you seen that work successfully?
Yeah, I have. And I think that, you know, to quote Viola Davis, when you hear and see someone sharing their story that resonates then with you, and of course it would resonate with your employees, all of a sudden you think, oh wow, you know, I'm not alone, and that starts to encourage more conversations within the organisation and more education around, you know, each of our lived experiences and barriers that we've faced, and all of a sudden it starts to kind of demystify or remove that this is, you know, really uncomfortable and really hard to talk about, you know, and that fear factor and that kind of, you know, cancel culture that we're seeing at the moment, where people are just scared of talking about these things now because of fear of getting it wrong.
I think it's more impactful a lot of the time when people hear colleagues talking about it as well, because it almost puts a face to the stories that you sometimes hear. You know, it's one thing doing a training module or something like that and hearing about these things and examples of discrimination or harassment or whatnot, but when you have a colleague talking about their own experiences, something that they've faced, whether in the workplace or outside of the workplace, then it really helps to bring it home that this isn't just something that happens somewhere, it's something that happens to people that you actually know. Yeah,
absolutely. Do you think there is a risk, a bit like we've been one of the earlier series, we've been talking about greenwashing, and there's definitely a shift within marketing teams to stop talking about their environmental credentials because there is a genuine fear that they're going to get called out for greenwashing. And we've seen a bit of that with, not this year, the year before, as International Women's Day, when a lot of businesses were called out for being very supportive of women on International Women's Day, but then, for example, their gender pay gap was perhaps somewhat questionable. Do you think that's something that is holding us back, particularly as a sector, from being more vocal about steps that we're taking outwardly?
I think it is, yeah, and you know, we've seen lots of comments from, you know, CEOs sort of saying, you know, D&I is dead, and you know it's not really that important, you know, now that we're post COVID and, you know, incidents like George Floyd. I think it can hold us back, and you know, ED&I is not just sort of the responsibility of, you know, the HR department or you know, diversity team. It starts with doesn't it? It starts with the whole organisation and everyone kind of really being committed, and just it's about being brave and vulnerable, and you know, if you get it wrong, it's okay, tell me how I can do better.
Yeah, absolutely, and allyship, yes, I think is absolutely essential. And I think from the examples that I've seen of organisations who are really starting to embed that culture so that it's lived and breathed by their employees, allyship is really key to that. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think that there's always a place for allies and authentic allyship. And I think that a lot of the time people are willing to do that. They just need to know how. I think one of the things that organisations can do quite effectively is some sort of bystander training or allyship training, or even an allyship pledge or something like that, which just really makes it easy for people to know what to do. And it doesn't have to be applicable to every case, and obviously each individual is different, but if you have a set of 5 principles which people can follow to be an authentic ally, then it just helps with that initial transition from being somebody who watches and might not intervene in anything that happens to somebody who actively promotes diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually saw on the tube, I was in London the other day, and there was a sign up talking, it was things like interrupt And then it was saying, if you're talking about sexual harassment, and it was saying that basically these are some things that you could say. So you could just ask somebody the time, or you could ask them what something about your next stop, just to interrupt the situation that was going on. And I thought that was really interesting because it was really visual, and it's almost that level of giving people the words to say in a situation that the tools, absolutely, when feeling uncomfortable. I thought that was really good and something that could be replicated in the workplace quite easily.
Yeah, I've seen lots of sort of allyship employee resource groups start to spin up now, and in particular there's one retail organisation that I know sort of built an allyship group that was focused around understanding women and menopause, and actively inviting lots of men to be part of that allyship group. And I know it's been really successful with just again that education piece, and just giving people the tools to have those conversations and just understand different lived experiences.
So, a question for both of you, really, but I'll start with you, Will. Are there any other organisations out there that you think they're doing a really good job in this space, or from from whom we could learn?
Yes, I think at Irwin Mitchell we're on a journey, but we're doing well, especially in certain areas. So we are one of the law firms with the better gender pay gap. So we're about 12.4% now. We've done a lot of analysis into that gender pay gap, and we're really trying to understand the reasons why that still remains. Part of the reason that gender pay gap is low is because we've got a gender balanced partnership. So over 50% of our partners are female. And I think a lot of the reason for that is, we did a survey fairly recently about why women leave the organisation. So part of a bigger survey, but we got our own set of responses at Irwin Mitchell, and the biggest contributors to women wanting to stay at Irwin Mitchell was around our flexible by choice policy. So the opportunity for people within the organisation to work flexibly in terms of time and location was a huge driver of people wanting to. So I think that's a really key policy and an example of where we've listened to our people and what they want, and then been able to enact that and had good results as part of that.
Is there any other organisations that you've read about or heard about that?
Yeah, I think PwC have come on a huge journey with their ED&I, and I think in particular it was really refreshing to see them really own kind of where they were at, and really publicly address with a very robust strategy on how they were going to start to address some of the gaps of talent in their organisation, particularly around race. So I know that they've done a lot to look at the systemic barriers that might prevent, for example, Latino or people of colour being able to join their organisation. And they've done a lot in particular around their recruitment strategy and some of the sort of essential criteria, such as having a degree of a certain standard and from a certain university that was previously a blocker. I think also I'm seeing a lot of your scale-up organisations, especially in the tech space, start to really look at really innovative policies such as shared maternity leave, flexible working policies, that really start to remove barriers and make the workplace a lot more accessible. I've seen organisations with, quiet spaces for people who are neurodiverse and things like that just, again, it all reinforces that, we're not just thinking about inclusion and, people fitting in. It's about actually people belonging and feeling like they belong.
I think there's some really good organisations out there who are doing more now to be able to use D&I as an incentive for other organisations to also focus on their ED&I performance. So BT, for example, are now granting a 3-year slot on their legal panel to the organisation who performs best in their ED&I performance.
Right.
So they are now, championing ED&I in a way that means that their suppliers also must be championing ED&I. And I think it's good to be, they're using the carrot rather than the stick there. They're not forcing anybody to do anything, but they're saying, this is the business benefit to you of being able to show us that you are really committed to diversity and inclusion.
I think it also brings up a really interesting point around the supply chain. And so how brands, companies can use their position to require their suppliers to meet certain standards. I mean, that is a real opportunity to
Absolutely.
accelerate change. You see that a lot with the franchising, obviously a lot within retail, leisure and hospitality, franchise businesses. And I think franchisors are starting to realise that it's necessary for them to think about their people, think about their brand when they're picking franchisees or when they're dealing with franchisees. So I think that's a real opportunity, and we're always looking for ways to accelerate the pace of change. And I think that is a real opportunity.
And it's a risk as well, because the more organisations that set supply diversity programs, if you're not in a position within your own organisation to be able to meet what they are wanting from you, then ultimately you'll end up being left behind.
Yeah, you're behind the curve. And, you know, it's something that the customers want now, and customers are driving a lot of change in this space because they want to see it. They want to shop and buy things from brands or products or services that have initiatives like this.
One of the things you both touched about policy, and you mentioned we are a law firm, so, you know, this has to come up at some point, I'm afraid. But we've seen a raft of legislation, particularly since April, actually, coming up through private members' bills, but surrounding a lot of the issues that we've been talking about today. So we've had the changes to flexible working, making that a day one right. We've had carers leave, lots of changes from a legislative perspective. And you know, if there is a change in government, Labour have also got some interesting ideas around worker status and other pieces of legislation. How much do you think that helps? Is it useful, these legislative changes? Do we need to go further? Will, I'm going to come to you on that one first.
I think it's a good step forwards, and I think that, I mean, I've already talked about flexible working previously, but I think in terms of supporting, I mean, not only women, but people with caring responsibilities more generally, people who are disabled, to be able to access the working environment more easily. As Ebony's already mentioned, it opens businesses up to be able to recruit from a wider and more diverse talent pool as well. But I think the important thing to remember is that these are minimum requirements, and that in order for them to be most effective, and for organisations and colleagues to be able to get the most out of what these policies are trying to achieve, we need to remember that it is a minimum and that each individual's circumstances is different. And the most important thing is open dialogue between employers and employees, and a lot of that will come from line managers. And I think it's really important that line managers are equipped, perhaps by their HR colleagues, with the skills to really understand what these changes mean, what it means for the business, and what it means for their relationship with their employees, and how each situation should be handled to get the best outcome from everybody.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that organisations should not just be looking at those minimum requirements, but also thinking about the future, thinking about those trends and trying to almost future-proof themselves as businesses, certainly global businesses, because by the time they might implement the minimum requirements, well, we're already on to kind of the next change in the next curve, which can ultimately be more damaging. So I think it's about, to touch on what Will says, it's about listening to your employees and colleagues and making sure they have a voice, but also starting to think about things a lot more longer term and strategically, so you can start to future-proof your business.
Yeah, I've got quite a good example of that recently. A client came to me with a partner policy to replace their paternity leave policy. Oh, wow. And they'd received feedback actually that had come through their family group and the employees, who'd fed back that if you're going to enhance paternity leave to, in that case, 2 weeks full pay, why is it only accessible by fathers? What is the purpose of that enhancement? What's the purpose of the leave? And it was so obvious, actually, but it's not something that we'd thought about. Yeah. And it was interesting that had come from, as you say, that really good dialogue with employees who had raised that point. And so obviously that's not something that they have to do. It's not a requirement in legislation. They want to go above and beyond. But absolutely, it's being open-minded and listening to employees so that you are ahead of the curve, and actually the policies that you're putting in place are having the desired effect, which is often not, if you just follow legislation, isn't always the case.
Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see if Labour get in, what further changes will come about. But I agree, legislation is usually behind the curve. It's usually after the event. So we should definitely be looking forward as organisations. So Ebony, you've recently graduated from the Diversity in Retail Ethnic Leaders programme. Easy for you to say. Based on your learnings from that programme, what are some of the main challenges, would you say, that retail, hospitality and leisure organisations are facing when they're looking to embrace equality, diversity and inclusion? And perhaps equally as important, where are they falling down?
Yeah, I think Will touched on this earlier. I think it's about understanding the demographics in your organisation, understanding the data, and what's the sort of temperature, what's the climate within the organisation. Because, programmes, trainings are absolutely fantastic. But, if coming back into the organisation, nothing around the individuals has changed, well, that sort of can be more damaging, and ultimately you risk maybe potentially losing those employees. So I think it's about understanding where you are now, and we've touched on it earlier, but starting to build out then actionable, but most importantly measurable outcomes that are directly linked to the particular organisation and the climate.
Yeah, I think it's that measurable bit that is quite challenging. I think, in terms of, absolutely necessary. But there was quite a lot of organisations were putting in place hard targets, percentages.
Yeah.
How, do you think they're beneficial, or?
I think if the targets are realistic and also based off of data, yes. I think having a target for target's sake, that would be ineffective. I think targets, and in particular, KPIs that are set for everyone in the organisation, or certainly a set of behaviours that perhaps then link to that, is really important, because then what you're saying to your employees is, this is something that's really important to us and there is an ROI, so actually as part of your objectives, this is something that we want you to drive. So potentially it might be hiring a certain number of women, it might be disabled colleagues, whatever it might be. So I think that there's definitely a benefit, but it has to be a realistic target, and it can't sort of just be a number plucked out of the air.
I think quite commonly organisations tend to set targets around diversity specifically, so representation at different levels, whether that's representation across an organisation or representation in terms of promotion figures and things like that. One of the things that we're trying to move forwards is, as well as measuring representation and diversity, measuring inclusion as well. So trying to look at measuring things like, if we can see from our data that the attrition figures are significantly different for colleagues with different characteristics, or we can see that promotion or performance rating figures are different for colleagues with different characteristics, then trying to look at that and set targets around either reducing those gaps, making sure that there's a balance in terms of, so that it's proportional, and then also looking at, for example, our data from our colleague engagement surveys and looking at perceptions and looking at, do our disabled colleagues have the same opinions on management or the same opinions on well-being as our colleagues without disabilities do, and then trying to measure perceptions from there. So trying to gauge, not only are we representative of the wider world in terms of who we have within the business, but those people from diverse backgrounds we have within the business, what do they think, and are their expectations and are their perceptions and experiences of the business the same as other colleagues?
And we've talked about, obviously, the importance of this being led from the top, about senior leaders, but you also touched on earlier, Will, about line managers and the really critical role they play. So just elaborate on that a bit more. What do you think we should be doing to support our line managers?
I think that's key, and it's part of our own internal diversity and inclusion strategy. And what I've been trying to talk about is a culture of consistency. so that where we have processes in place and policies in place, making sure that they are applied consistently across various business areas, across the offices, across different teams, to make sure that the experience of an individual, whether they're from a diverse background or not, is the same or is as it should be for them as an individual, regardless of who their line manager is or which team they're sat in, because ultimately we want to make sure that Irwin Mitchell as a culture works for everybody, and that culture should be set at an organisational level. And part of that is around making sure that line managers fully understand all the policies and processes in place. They understand what they need to be doing about them, how to deal with different situations. And as part of our policies for key areas, we try to produce line manager guidance to set alongside those policies, so that, you know, we're not just leaving line managers to try and figure it out for themselves. You know, we're trying to make it easier for them in that step by step and providing more support in that manner.
I think reverse mentoring programs can be really powerful to help leaders at all levels of an organisation and help employees overall, because I think that there can sometimes maybe be a disconnect, and also it's really hard in an organisation, certainly if you are from a minoritised group, to perhaps say to your manager, hey, you know, I feel triggered by what you said, or actually I'm really struggling in this environment because I'm neurodiverse and the light's too harsh, and actually I might need to work from home a few more days a week. And that's where I think reverse mentoring, and mentoring as well, but reverse mentoring in particular, because it's about that leader learning about different lived experiences that they perhaps wouldn't have even thought about. And you know what you know, don't you? And I think that can start to get leaders thinking not just about their own experiences and your own kind of way that you go about the workplace, but starting to think about your team members and think about wider colleagues in the organisation, and that I think can be really powerful to help move on change and conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's around that education piece, isn't it? And I think I'm also a big supporter of reverse mentoring. I think it's a brilliant opportunity. I suppose probably one of the challenges for a larger organisation is how to effectively support a large group of line managers, whereas reverse mentoring, it might work for your senior leadership team. I wonder whether it might be more challenging if you've got 500 plus employees, so then let's say 100 line managers. It's finding ways in which to support at the heart of the organisation where the experiences of the colleagues are taking place. And I don't know whether you've seen any effective, some organisations have very good ED&I training, but have you seen it where it's been targeting line managers or?
I think where I've seen it work really well is perhaps really initiatives that are encouraging lots of line managers from all around your group, certainly if you're global or a large organisation, into those ERGs, and then being set kind of objectives. So they're not just a sort of silent participant of those groups, they're being set sort of, objectives to kind of come away from those groups and start to embed, it doesn't have to be large things, but small things within their own teams, or start to have certain conversations.
That's a really good idea. I think encouraging that participation in the employee representation groups is a really good way of, again, the shared learning, but also getting them involved and getting them to see different perspectives. I think that's a really good idea. I've seen a lot of clients embrace e-learning, but I have to say, e-learning is a tool, and I think but it needs to be a part of your toolkit, rather than the only way in which you're trying to upskill. But I think it is a challenge. I think making sure that making sure that your values are being represented out in the workplace every day as an organisation. That is quite a challenge if you're a bigger organisation, and that consistency, I agree, Will, having that consistency of approach is going to be helpful. Have you seen training around unconscious bias? That was something that we were seeing a considerable amount of, let's say, a few years ago, but I have seen less of that more recently, which I think is a shame, because I think that's a really important part of that upskilling.
I think unconscious bias seemed to go a little bit out of fashion in the last couple of years for some reason. I mean, there was talk of moving from unconscious bias to conscious inclusion, which is probably a good step in terms of, you know, it's good to be aware of your bias, but then what are you actually going to do about it, I guess, is that next step. But
it could be really effective having your e-learnings, having your modules around unconscious bias filter through into, you know, every bit of training that you might roll out as an organisation. So, for example, your leadership training, your recruitment training, you know, it falls part of every facet of the organisation, doesn't it? And I think it's important to not just have a once a year training or a one-off training on unconscious bias or conscious inclusion, but it's about kind of almost that drum constantly being beaten.
So just to help us wrap up, if you had one message that you would like to deliver to an organisation, or all organisations listening today, what would that one message be around ED&I?
I think it would be, if I had a message, it would be as an exec leadership team to get together and start to, you know, challenge behaviours, challenge policy, and start to think about the why when it comes to ED&I, and really sort of think about that meaningfully and start to drive that then down through the organisation. I think it has to be a top-down but also a bottom-up approach and a multi-pronged one. So I think it would be that message from me.
Yeah, I think one of the most impactful things that organisations can do is listening to your people and asking them what they think should be done and what would most support them in their job and in their role. So making use of the ARGs if you have them, if not, holding open forums to be able to get that input from your colleagues, because ultimately they're the people who make the business tick and they're the people who you're relying on in a lot of cases. So if they feel listened to and they feel valued and respected, then I think that goes a long way to supporting your ED&I strategy.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's about employees not just having a voice, but it's about helping them actually get to the table to have a voice in the first place.
And a voice that's listened to.
Yeah.
To bring this episode to a close, in our last podcast where we talked about the advances in tech in the age of AI, we were joined by Gareth Rees-John, Chief Digital Officer at Kurt Geiger. And he left you a question, Ebony. So he'd like to know, how can technology, and particularly the emergence of AI, help you to understand where you sit and how to move forward with inclusion and diversity within your organisation?
That's such a good question, and AI is definitely a hot topic at the moment, isn't it? I think AI can be a fantastic tool that can really help just give organisations a starting point of where they are and some solutions to help them on their D&I maturity. I will say that I think it's important to remember that technology, AI, is a tool, and a tool that still needs to have that sort of human aspect given to it, and human considerations, ethical ones at that. And it is about, you know, what data is being used, and that data being from diverse data sets, and looking at how it's designed in an inclusive way and developed in an inclusive way. But I think it can be really positive as long as it's used in the right way.
Our next episode will be looking at how businesses can achieve net zero with Jose Aguirre-Schwank, Head of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability at River Island. So to keep the conversation going, Ebony, what would your question on ESG be to Jose?
My question would be, certainly with changes in ESG policies and reporting, how can organisations create a really robust ESG strategy and future-proof themselves for the future? And what then are the benefits to ED&I with having a strategy like that?
So that's great. Thanks, Ebony. And Will, thank you both for joining us today. And thank you so much for sharing your stories and insights with us. And to you, of course, our listeners, thanks again for tuning in. We've got one final episode of this series coming up where we'll be discussing net zero. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out that episode or any future episodes from this podcast. Bye for now.